So this birthday, last birthday, June 7th, if you want to make a note of it, anybody? Jill took me, both the kids' girlfriends and fiancés were not in the city, so it was just the four of us for dinner. Had a lovely dinner, and somehow during the dinner, the discussion came around to the Bible. Now, both my kids have been raised their whole life. I was ordained before either one of them were born, right? So their whole life, all they've had, not that it's an only, but all they've ever known is a minister as a father, right? Which kind of plays with your mind in and of itself, but that's apparently their lot in life, right, is having a minister as a father. So we get to the Bible, and my son says, "I'm sorry, Dad, but the Bible is a book of haters." Right? He said the only people that read the Bible are haters. It's a book of haters. And I said, it is not a book of haters. And he said, Dad, it is. If you look at who's talking about in the Bible, it's all the people that are hating all the other people. And you know what? At some level, I'm going, darn. That's not exactly what I said at the time, but it was like, and I looked at my daughter like, come on, jump in, save me. And she said, Dad, look at it. Right? Racism, sexism, look at the bigotry in the world. Who tends to be the biggest proponent of it? It's all the people that are banging on the Bible the loudest, all the fundamentalists, wherever they are. And it was like so crushing to me. You know, both my kids were raised in this church. You know, and for them to think, right, that the Bible is a book of haters, well, I clearly understand their point of view. It makes me sad. Because I look at all the spiritual depth that's in that book. There's thousands and thousands of years of spiritual depth and teaching and understanding. And if what people are hearing is hate out of it, I think we did something wrong. And so one of the commitments I made was to make sure I'm doing my little part in bringing it to light. And really looking at what Jesus taught. And really then applying it to say, how do we live that in our own lives? Are we living what he taught, what he said? Because everybody gets to interpret what they read any way they want. But at least if we take a look at it, we can really see, what does that mean to me? What does that look like? And I'm not talking tonight about obscure passages somewhere in the Old Testament that nobody's read for 1,000 years. I'm talking about what Jesus was his prime teaching. Was his most important stuff. So this week we're going to launch into a 6-week series based on, how many of you have read Emmett Fox's book, Sermon on the Mount? It is a classic New Thought book. It's classic. It is a spiritual understanding of Jesus' prime spiritual teaching. So that's where we're going to begin. So we're going to take it apart. We're going to go section by section. We're going to look at it, And then you can decide for yourself, is this a book of haters? Or is there still relevant spiritual teaching for today? I know which way I'd like you to lean, right? But if we're not bringing it into context, if we're not making it meaningful and real for people today, then it begins to feel like just one more thing we're getting banged on. So, are you ready? Okay. So the first chapter is entitled, What Did Jesus Teach? So guess what we're going to talk about today? I love a bright room, you know? Okay, so we're going to look at Sermon on the Mount. So let's begin by looking at what Jesus didn't teach. Let's throw the first slide up there. When you look at what Jesus taught, especially in the Sermon on the Mount, there is no system of theology or doctrine taught. Right? How many of you know that all religions have a doctrine or a theology that is the basis of what they teach? Right? So every religion has a doctrine or a basis of everything they teach. And what I want you to see is that we take scriptures, ideas, concepts. Some of them are actually not anywhere in the Bible, and we create a doctrine. And then we look for things in Scripture to prove that our doctrine is right. And not only right, but it's more right than any other doctrine. All right? Does that make sense? Because if you're not the rightest, don't email me, I know, right? If you're not the rightest, then at some level you're wrong. Because when it comes in religious discussion, there only gets to be one right answer, right? Have you ever heard that or that idea when people are arguing about what the right doctrine is? The belief is that there can only really be one right doctrine. And what I want you to see is that Jesus didn't care. He didn't teach doctrine. He wasn't about doctrine. And in fact, and this is going to freak some people out, he was an anarchist. Right? He actually spoke against the doctrine of the time. He actually healed people on the Sabbath, and he said it wasn't so much what you put in your mouth, which was really important part of the doctrine at his time. It wasn't as important what you put in your mouth as he said what came out of your mouth, right? So he didn't worry about doctrine. So, and it even goes a little bit further than that. He wasn't even promoting Christianity. Right? Because he wasn't concerned about doctrine. So I'm trying to stay good. So what he was concerned about was really, I believe, two things. Supporting people and having a rich, deep, personal relationship with God, and teaching spiritual principles. Right? That over and over and over again, that's what he was about. Now, let's go to the next one. Give me the next slide, Don. Okay, this is going to freak some people out. Jesus didn't give a plan for salvation. Now you think, well, he had to give a plan. I mean, isn't the whole Christianity based on a plan for salvation? Didn't he give a plan for salvation? And the answer is actually no. Did he talk about, I am the way, the truth, and the life? How many of you have heard that? Yes, right? But was he saying that we had to believe in him to be the way, the truth, and the life? Or did he say that he was the living example of being the way, the truth, and the life? I would like to vote that he was saying that he was the living example, that he wasn't giving a path for salvation, because why? Who knows why? You don't give a path for something if you don't think it's needed. You don't teach something that's, in your mind, irrelevant, right? I mean, most times, and maybe in some colleges, you got to teach something that you think is totally irrelevant, but it's because it's part of the syllabus, you teach it anyway. So Jesus didn't teach a plan of salvation, and then the question becomes, why did he not? He didn't because he believed that we were all connected with God. You don't need to be saved if you're already there. Right? So I want you just to entertain that idea for a minute. That if you're already there, if you're already connected, if you're already saved, you don't need to be saved again. Does that make sense? And you don't have to agree with anything that I'm saying, because this is just, again, my theology, and it's not really what Jesus taught, but I'm not going. But it's just true, right? All right. So the two things I want you to really hear me say: Jesus did not teach doctrine or theology. Okay? He talked about a relationship, and he talked about spiritual principles. He did not teach a path to salvation. Right? Because he believed that we were already saved, that we were already one with God. Okay, let's go to slide number 3, and this is hopefully going to... He did teach consequences of choice. Now, what does that mean? Jesus taught that every choice we make has a consequence. Now, how many of us like that? No, we don't like that, right? Because we want to make whatever choice we want to make. We want what we want when we want it, and we don't want there to be any consequence for the choices that we make, right? But because we were given free will, and I want you to stay with me, because we were given free will, if you give people absolute free will, the only way you can do that is if there's a learning curve for the choices you make. Now, say that God made you this powerful spiritual being. Are you willing to believe that? That you're a powerful, created in the image and likeness spiritual being, okay? Now, if you don't realize that there's consequences for choices, you can get yourself in a hot mess. Right? Anybody ever been in a hot mess in their life? Right? And can you see that you actually made choices to get yourself involved in a hot mess? Like, nobody just came up, and maybe some people helped you, supported you, and get into that hot mess, but at some level, you made the choices to get into that hot mess, and the reason that you were given complete free will to make whatever decision you wanted was because that God knew that we were smart enough, right? That we could learn from our choices, and that we could become wiser, greater, more powerful spiritual beings. Okay? Say I gave you a pebble, and you throw it up in the air, and it hits you in the head. Right? The next day, I give you a little bigger pebble. You throw it up in the air, and it hits you in the head. Now, how many days in a row would I have to give you a slightly bigger pebble till it got to be a rock or maybe a boulder before you quit throwing it up in the air and hitting yourself in the head? How many days? 1? How many of you have made the same mistake more than once? Even though it was a big mistake or an interesting mistake or a mistake that you saw the consequences, right? So, because we were given absolute free will, complete free will, there has to be a logical consequence for every choice. Now, the moment you start talking about consequences, because of the way that most of us were raised, we start going into shame. Right? So we make a bad choice, and we feel shame. We feel bad, right? We don't say, oh, that was interesting. I don't need to make that one again. Or I want to make that one 1,000 more times just for grins to make sure it always works out that way. But what happens for most of us is that we make a choice, we go into shame, and then we tend to, what do most people do when they go into shame? retreat. We isolate, right? So we make a bad choice, right? And the greater the bad choice is, the more shame we go into, and the more that we tend to isolate. We tend to isolate from the people that love us, and we tend to isolate from God. Thank you. You're paying attention. I appreciate that, right? So we tend to isolate not only from the people that love us, but we tend to want to isolate even from God. Because if we can't forgive ourselves, we assume that God can't forgive ourselves. But that leads us to the next thing that Jesus taught. Let's go to the fourth slide, last one. Nothing keeps us from God. Nothing keeps us from God. No matter what choice you make, God is there. And Jesus taught us, judge not. Is that true? And we're going to talk about that in one of the... Jesus taught us to judge not. So if Jesus taught us not to judge, guess what God has to do then? Not judge. So the entire universe just says, I love you, and that was an interesting choice. Right? I love you. I double dog love you. I completely love you. I love you the moment I created you. And you can make that choice 1,000 more times. You can create havoc and mayhem and madness and destruction and pillage the planet and burn it down and destroy it. And guess what? I love you. He said, well, you can't love me if I'm making that bad of a choice. Well, I'm God. Of course I can love you. And all that it requires is that we actually turn our attention toward God to feel God's infinite love for us. But when we think we've made a bad choice, we isolate and wander, and we don't feel connected anymore. And then we wander for so long that we think God has left us. When the reality was, there's no place God could have gone. That God just loves you. So I want you to think for a second about your bad choice. Does everybody have one? Like something you've done or something, that you regret or you have a story about or blah, 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 blah. I want you to see your bad choice. And the question that I have for you tonight, as we're playing in these concepts and these ideas, has your bad choice, whatever it was, whatever it continued to be, kept you from deepening your relationship with God? And would you be willing tonight to have a deeper, more profound relationship with God? I want to prove my point. Reading from Luke 15, the parable of the lost son. Jesus continued, there was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to the father, Father, give me my share of the estate. So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all that he had, and he set off for a distant country, and he squandered his wealth on wild living. How many identify? Where are my wild livers, right? Right? Squandered his wealth on wild living. After he had spent everything he had, of course, there was a severe famine that came upon the whole country. And he began to be in need. So he went and he hired himself to the citizen of that country. So he went to the fields and he fed the pigs. He no longer filled his stomach with the pot, and he would have longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but nobody gave him anything. Okay, let's put this in context. This is spoken to a Jewish community. Jewish community feeding the hogs. Was that a good idea or a bad idea? Bad idea. So is this the low of the low? This is hitting bottom, right? When he came to his senses, in some scriptures it says, and he came to himself, like he woken, and said, how many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? I will sit back and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you, and I'm no longer being worthy to be called your son, but make me like one of your hired servants. So he got up and he went to his father. But when he was still a long ways off, his father saw him, and was filled with great compassion. And he ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you, and I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him, and bring rings for his fingers and sandals for his feet, and bring the fatted calf and kill it, and we'll have a feast and celebrate. For the son of mine was dead, and now he's alive. He was lost, but now he's found. So they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, the older son was still in the fields. And he came near their house, and he heard the music and the dancing. So he came to one of the servants and asked, What's going on? Your brother has come home, he replied, and your father has killed the fatted calf because he is back and he is safe and he is sound. And the older brother became very angry and refused to go in. So the father had to go out and get him and pleaded with him. But he said to the father, Look, all these years I've been like a slave to you, never disobeying your orders. Yet you gave me not even one goat to celebrate with my friends. But when the son of yours comes home, who squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fatted calf for him. Son, the father said, you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But he had to celebrate and be glad because the brother of yours was dead, and now he's alive. He was lost, but now he's found. Okay? So here's the deal, right? So what was Jesus teaching here? Could you ever make a mistake that was so great that God would stop loving you? Anybody want to vote for no? You can't make a mistake that's ever so great that God will ever stop loving you. So you can never make the big mistake. There is no such thing as the unpardonable sin. None. It doesn't exist. There is no such thing that can keep you from God's everlasting love for you. Now, what can keep us from God's everlasting love for us? What's the only thing that can keep us from God's everlasting love for us? Us, right? That when we get in our shame and we're feeding the hogs and we're having a hard time, when we believe that somehow either God wanted that for us or we deserve that. That we never turn our focus toward God and come home. Now, how many of you identify with the older brother? Anybody? You don't have to raise your hand. From time to time, I identify with the older brother, right? Because I feel like I did all the right things. And why should anybody else be forgiven because they did it wrong, right? If I'm just here doing all the good things, right things, why should anybody else be forgiven because I'm playing the game right and fair and the way it's supposed to be played, right? And so I sometimes want to check how everybody else is doing. Does anybody else ever do that? Do you ever kind of do an inventory on anybody else in your life? Do you have a friend or a family member that you might kind of want to do an inventory and say, I don't understand why they're so blessed? Right? Because they're out doing all this stuff, and I know that they shouldn't be doing that stuff. Right? And I'm here to just check on them. Right? And I don't like the idea that God forgave them. I don't like the idea that God just loves them anyway. I want them just a little bit punished. True? Come on. Don't you have somebody in your life who's done you wrong and you want God just to punish them just a little bit for doing you wrong? You don't want them to have God's everlasting love and abundance. You want them to have to squirm just a little bit before they get it. Right? And if we tell ourselves the truth, I want you to see that we are both. We are both the younger brother who squandered the blessings of God, and we're the older brother who wants everybody else to pay for the way they squandered it. And who's really keeping track and feels like God didn't give us enough of a goat. True? So here's what I want you to look at in your life tonight. Can you see a way that you've squandered your spiritual gifts? Can you see a way that maybe you've squandered the blessings of God in your life? And that's the younger brother. And can you see a way that you're the older brother? That you're checking on everybody, or at least a couple people, to make sure that they get just their just desserts, which is no dessert at all. Right? Because what I want you to see is Jesus was really clear that no matter where you go, no matter what you do, God is right there. And the moment you turn your focus toward God, everything that God is available to you. That salvation is not a process. It's an instantaneous experience of turning your focus toward God. Will you pray with me? And I invite you to open your mind, your heart, your soul to the activity of God that is right here, right now. That there is only one presence and one power. And that power is good, that power is God, that power loves us unconditionally. That we are God's beloved. That no matter what mistakes, no matter what choices, that the consequence for every mistake is feeling separate from God. And the solution in every mistake is to come back to God. In the name and through the power of the living Christ, we give thanks. Amen.